Welcome to Colorado, where the beer is good, the snow is better, and for the first time in a long time, the football ain't half bad either. I've made a terrible mistake. I just realized that. I skied yesterday, and now I got into a squat and I can't get back up. Mistakes were made. Oh, God. All right, I'm sitting now, and it's way, way better. Look, I came out here to Colorado to do three things. Number one, go skiing. Number two, go snowmobiling. And number three, which is probably the most important one here, talk about the Broncos. More specifically, we're going to talk about how the Broncos started out 1-5 with a defense that was on pace to be one of the worst in the entire history of the sport, and how that bottom feeder team rebounded into being a fringe playoff contender with one of the most effective defenses in the NFL. In the first 5 games of the season, Denver was allowing a whopping 36 points per game, including a 70-burger given up to the Dolphins, but it wasn't just the Dolphins game that skewed their stats. I mean, even taking that game completely out, they still allowed almost 28 per game to the Jets, Bears, and Raiders, all of which had, and for the most part still have, not great offenses. Absolutely nothing was working. And then a switch was flipped. Well, multiple switches, actually. And those switches are what we're going to talk about today. Now, the 3 main reasons why Denver went from a bottom feeder to a legitimate playoff contender. Number 1, of course, personnel changes, and their depth chart is a lot different now than it was at the start of the season. Number 2, there was also a pretty big change in blitz percentage, which affected their pass rush. And number 3, which is probably the most obvious contributing factor, turnovers. They forced more turnovers than anybody else during their win streak by far. Our goal today is both to explain how the Broncos saved their season, as well as to try to figure out if their loss to Houston last week was more of a blip on the radar, or maybe a sign of their magic finally running out. Let's get into it. First things first, let's talk personnel changes, because all of these tweaks to the starting lineup played a key role in Denver's overall defensive improvement. This is the Broncos depth chart from back at the start of September. On the D-line, you have Allen, Jones, and Harris as the interior 3 in base personnel groupings, with Randy Gregory and Jonathan Cooper as the starting edges. Then on the second level, Denver had Alex Singleton and Josie Jewell, which is still the same pairing today. And finally, in the secondary, when they were in nickel personnel, their starting corners were Patrick Surtain, Damari Mathis, and then Asang Bassi in the slot, while their starting safeties were Justin Simmons and Kareem Jackson. This whole group got absolutely lit up over the first month of the season, and a few key injuries during that stretch to guys like Simmons and Jewell didn't help much either. They couldn't get any pressure because Gregory was playing extremely poorly with a terrible overall pass rush win rate, and to be specific, he was 108th among all edge rushers in that statistical category, and meanwhile Frank Clark wasn't even earning any snaps to begin with. On the back end, the Broncos couldn't cover anyone either because Mathis was losing all of his one-on-ones outside, and they also had yet to solidify their slot corner position. It was all just a mess, and they were ruthlessly exploited every single week, with that infamous Miami game being especially miserable. Vance Joseph knew that if he was going to turn things around, he was going to have to make drastic changes to the personnel he had on the field, and so he did. Damari Mathis had his snaps greatly reduced after the Dolphins game, while Jaquan McMillan started to get his playing time increased, and by week 4, McMillan immediately became an impact player every single game. Justin Simmons also came back from injury in week 4, while Jewell got back from injury in week 5, and PJ Locke and Fabian Moreau also started getting more snaps and carved out roles as the third safety and third corner, respectively. By week 6, the Broncos defense as we know it today had mostly solidified, and more young talent had finally found their roles on this team. By this point, Randy Gregory and Frank Clark were both long gone, paving the way for a young starting edge duo of Cooper and Bonito to get most of the work, and then 1 week later, in week 7, they finally got Baron Browning back from an off-season knee injury, which gave them a key third piece to their edge rush rotation that they were really missing. Overall, by the end of October, the Broncos defense featured 5 new starters and/or contributors, and all of those changes collectively helped to transform this unit into an aggressive, disciplined, playmaking machine. Emphasis on the word aggressive, by the way, because the second major change that helped to spark this resurgence was their pass rush. From week 6 onward, Vance Joseph became one of the most blitz-happy defensive coordinators in the entire NFL. And it worked. Denver's blitz rate in that time period was just over 38%, which was the 6th highest rate in the league, compared to the first 5 weeks of the season where they were 17th at just barely 30%. I know that 8% change might not seem like much, but it really, really is. That translates to roughly 5 or 6 more blitzes per game on average, and each one of those blitzes individually was a big play waiting to happen. I'll use this example from Week 8 against the Chiefs, in which Denver held KC to just 9 points. They forced 2 picks from Patrick Mahomes and sacked him 3 times on their way to a huge win. This is a 3rd and 4 opportunity deep in the 3rd quarter, and you could see all these Broncos DBs in the secondary trying to communicate with each other to figure out what their bunch check is here against this bunch look from KC, which ultimately ends up being what some coaches refer to as a lock and level check. Lock and level is a man coverage check versus a bunch where every corner is locked onto a receiver within that bunch and is not going to pass them off, and they're going to line up at different levels so that it's a lot harder for them to get picked off on switch releases by these receivers, on a rub concept, or anything like that. Now, the overall defensive call here looks like cover 1 on the back end, so man coverage across the board with a single high safety, but there is also a cross dog blitz up front involving both of these inside linebackers, while the edge rusher to the side of the running back, he's going to be the flare control player if their running back releases fast to the flat. Some coaches also refer to that as a peel alert because he will peel off of his pass rush and become a coverage player if he reads that release. The important thing that I want you to take note of from this rep is that the coverage actually does not hold up here. The short return motion from the Chiefs causes some kind of miscommunication on the back end with their lock and level check, which results in 2 Broncos players initially mirroring the number 3 receiver instead of just one of them following him. So Simmons has to react late and try to run step for step with a vertical threat that he has no prayer of catching up to. If Mahomes would have been able to see this coverage bust and the route come wide open, it probably would have been a touchdown. However, the pressure that Vance Joseph dialed up made sure that didn't happen. Everyone up front did a really nice job of compressing the pocket and not giving any lanes for Mahomes to escape out of with his legs, and the linebackers in particular did an excellent job of penetrating into the A-gaps and beating the running back in protection. All Mahomes really had time to do was check his first read to the flat off the switch release, which was covered, and by the time he could even peek downfield at his alert, which was not covered, the pocket was just gone and he had to step up straight into Singleton and eat the sack. Again, I cannot stress this enough, the blitz made this play happen, and blitzes like this one made many more sacks and turnovers happen throughout the rest of the season as well as the Broncos were on their win streak. The secondary obviously has also been better overall since Moreau, McMillan, and Locke started getting more snaps, but it's Denver's pressure rate that is really the difference here. In weeks 1 through 5, the Broncos' pressure rate was 31st in the NFL at just 29%. Only Arizona was worse. But from week 6 onward, when Joseph started calling more blitzes and forcing offenses to give his playmakers more one-on-one pass rush opportunities, then Denver's pressure rate as a team jumped up to 38%, good for 12th in the NFL. For context, an elite pressure rate is generally going to be somewhere in the low to mid 40s, so Denver has not been that far off from elite in that category recently. Pressure creates big play opportunities. It speeds up the internal clocks of quarterbacks, even the great ones. It forces them to make uncharacteristic mistakes. And most of all, in addition to creating negative plays, pressure also helps to create the most valuable defensive statistic of them all: turnovers. Now, before I dive into the absurdity that is the rate of turnovers that the Broncos were able to generate and how exactly they were able to do that, I want to extend my heartfelt condolences to everybody out there whose season started just as terribly as Denver's, but who were unable to recover as well as the Broncos did. That's about fantasy football, by the way. That's what I'm talking about here. Some of you that are watching this are long out of your league at this point. Your team is trash, your injury luck was awful, you spent your fab all wrong, you took a flyer on a rookie receiver in the draft, but it was Quentin Johnston instead of Zay Flowers. I mean, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong for you.
There's nothing wrong with it. There are dozens of us. Dozens!
But fear not, I have a solution for you to feel whole as a person again, and it's called Playoff Best Ball. If you don't know what playoff best ball is, for instance, if you play on Underdog Fantasy, up to 6 players will draft 10 rounds with a roster construction of 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 2 wide receivers or tight ends, and 1 flex. The games start in the wildcard round and run through the end of the playoffs, and it's best ball format, so you don't have to set a lineup, just whichever players at those positions that are on your roster score the highest, those will be the points that you get credit for. The thing that makes playoff best ball different is that you have to be really good at predicting playoff matchups and which teams you think are going to advance, because once a team gets eliminated in the playoffs, you can't use their players anymore, obviously. So for instance, last year, if you had a bunch of Eagles and Chiefs players in playoff best ball, you probably won by a lot. So if you think you have a good handle on not just which teams are going to make the playoffs this year, like maybe the Broncos, but you also think you have a good idea of which teams are going to go all the way, you might like playoff best ball. You can check it out over on Underdog Fantasy and use my promo code Brett at the link in the description below, or you can use the QR code that's on the screen right now and go there that way. And signing up with that promo code will automatically double any deposit you make up to $100, so you get a bunch of extra money to use on the platform. And you're also going to get access to a free special, which if you're doing this before the Monday game, it's going to be Tua at higher than half of a passing yard. So if you also happen to like playing pick'ems, those specials are there for you as well. Thank you to Underdog for partnering with this channel and supporting everything that we do here, including videos like this one on the Broncos defense. And with that, let's get back to talking about those Broncos, and in particular, talking about their turnovers. I think there's a misconception out there, at least a little bit, that the Broncos got lucky with how many turnovers they were able to generate between weeks 7 through 12 when they were on that win streak. And don't get me wrong, there were some lucky turnovers where, say, a ball bounced off a receiver's hands straight into the waiting arms of a safety, or there was a massive overthrow straight to a DB, or what amounts to essentially a Hail Mary getting picked off. But for every quote-unquote lucky turnover, which most people would not consider sustainable, there were 2 actually forced turnovers by this Broncos defense, which kind of is sustainable. They had 17 total turnovers during their win streak. They led the entire NFL during that time period with 16 forced fumbles in only 5 games, and they recovered 9 of them. That is insane. Every single tackle was treated by this Broncos defense as an excuse to attack the ball. I mean, it looked like a team full of dudes with rabies out there. That's how aggressive they were. But that aggressiveness was paid off in takeaways, which then paid off in wins. Say whatever you want about their play style basically sitting on a knife's edge every single game, but it worked. Also, by the way, while we're on this topic, I do want to specifically touch on Jaquan McMillan and his impact on this defense, and of course their ability to force all these turnovers, because he's been one of the biggest overall factors in this team winning games. The short version of this spiel is that he's a monster, obviously, but the long version is that he's a monster that clearly studies his ass off in the film room. There was a pick that he had against the Chiefs this year that just completely blew me away, because I think it showed incredible discipline and intelligence on J-Mac's part against arguably the most disciplined and intelligent offensive duo in the league, Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. The Broncos are showing cover 3 here pre-snap, but they're going to be rotating post-snap into a cover 2 look, and McMillan in particular is playing the field side hook zone in that cover 2 look. Now, the Chiefs actually have a vertical concept dialed up here that is pretty decent against cover 2 on paper, because it's designed to create space for Kelce to bend into a wide open seam area behind that hook zone. And again, in theory, the deep cross from the number 3 is going to take away the pull runner down the middle, while the number 1 is going to draw that deep safety towards the boundary. So the horizontal stretch should create a small throwing lane within that seam for Mahomes to hit Kelce as he bends that route back inside. However, what Mahomes and Kelce do not account for is that McMillan is reading both of them like a book. When the ball was snapped, as soon as Kelce took an outside release to go around McMillan, J-Mac knew what was coming and he had the freedom to break on it. He is not concerned about Kelce taking an outside release to run a slot fade or an out route or anything like that. He knows he has zone help to the outside, so he doesn't need to take that bait and widen out with him. And at the same time, he also knows that most of the time, if Kelce is releasing outside like that, it's just in an effort to create space for him to go back inside. So naturally, his assumption is that something is going to develop behind him in that zone area. McMillan's only job here is to protect that inside seam, and he does it by immediately getting his eyes back onto Mahomes, reading his shoulders, reading his eyes, and drifting back to the inside so that he can undercut that route for the pick. This interception is all about trust and feel. He trusts that the structure of the coverage will allow him to be aggressive inside, and he feels that the route from Kelce will be bending back behind him just based on that release. McMillan makes high IQ plays like this one every single week, and he's been emblematic of the overall evolution of this defense. It's a smarter unit now. It's a more aggressive unit. It's a playmaking unit. And quite frankly, in a lot of these Broncos wins this year, that unit is the main reason why this team even had a chance of winning to begin with. Now, all of that being said though, I do want to emphasize that I'm still not entirely sure how sustainable all of this really is. I don't think that this is a 16 points allowed per game kind of defense like they were during their win streak. I mean, clearly just based on the Houston game, they are not that. But I also don't think that they're nearly bad enough to ever give up 36 a game again like they did early in the year. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle, which is a very solid, very reliable defense that is not a pushover at all and has some really nice young pieces that are worth building around. Is that enough for the Broncos to make the playoffs this year after starting 1-5 and maybe go on an improbable run with a little help from some vintage Russell Wilson magic? Maybe, or maybe not. Either way, I'm excited to find out what this team has left in the tank. Thank you for watching all the way to the end if you're still here. Also, thank you to Colorado for playing host to me for the last week. It is gorgeous out here, and I cannot wait to come back. Just simply incredible. Like 10 out of 10 state, wouldn't change a thing. Also, one more note, make sure to join the Discord that is linked down in the description below. There's also a section there for patrons only if you also happen to be a supporter on Patreon and support everything that we do here. With that said, thank you all for being here to the very, very end. I'm going to fly back to LA now and finish this episode now that I've recorded it and start to work on the next one. I'll see you then.